Good morning and welcome to the Office of Procurement Regulations webinar on developing the annual procurement plan. I am Rhonda Joy Lewis, Corporate Communications Officer at the OPR, and it is a pleasure to have you join us for this informative session, which is intended to provide you with guidance on the development and publication of the annual schedule of procurement activities for fiscal 2020-2021. Our feature presenters for today's webinar are Ms. Devika Singh and Mr. Ian Samaru, Policy Officers at the OPR. We will have our Chairman and Procurement Regulator, Mr. Munilal Lalchan, with us, and while he will not officiate today, he is available to take any questions that you may have as we go through the presentation. It must also be noted that today's webinar is being recorded and will be shared via notification to your email. Before we begin the formal aspects of our session, please allow me to go through some helpful tips for a successful webinar experience. Be an active participant. Questions may be provided in the Q&A section of the portal. Respond to any requests for comments and questions. In the chat forum, please keep your contributions helpful and be considerate of the host and other participants. And finally, we welcome any feedback at the end of the webinar. Feel free to help us improve future webinars to better match your needs by letting us know what worked well and what didn't. At this time, I would like to bring your attention to the screens as we become familiar to navigate through the webinar platform this morning. There are two sections on the platform that you can utilize to communicate with us. The chat section can be used for general feedback during the webinar, while you can utilize the Q&A section of the portal to submit your questions on the presentations. We will also upload useful and other important links and information, such as a case study and guidelines, in the handout section of the portal. So at this time, I would like to invite Ms. Pastora Brown, Head Procurement Policy Development, to deliver the opening remarks. Ms. Brown?
Thank you, Rhonda. I want to say a very special good morning as I warmly welcome you to the Office of Procurement Regulations webinar on developing the annual procurement plan and the accompanying annual schedule of planned procurement activities. I am Pastora Brown, Head Procurement Policy Development at the OPR. Between this morning's and this afternoon's sessions, we have approximately 350 individuals from a wide cross-section of public bodies registered to attend this webinar. And we are grateful that you have taken time from your busy schedules to actually be here, albeit virtually, with us today. Planning of the procurement activities is listed in the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act as the first stage of the procurement cycle. In addition, the Act mandates that within 6 weeks after approval of the national budget, each public body shall publish, either on its website or in any other electronic format, its annual schedule of planned procurement activities for the fiscal. Beyond that, the public body is also required to provide a printed copy of its annual schedule of planned procurement activities upon request by any member of the public or any contractor or supplier. To assist public bodies in fulfilling these requirements, under the Resources tab on the OPR's website, you will find a draft general guideline entitled Developing the Annual Procurement Plan. And within that guideline at section 5.0, you would have noted the guidance provided on the development of the annual schedule of planned procurement activities. This morning, using a worked example, 2 policy officers from the OPR's Procurement Policy Development Department, Ms. Devika Singh and Mr. Ian Samaru, will take you through the steps involved in developing your annual procurement plan. At the end of today's session, you will be able to answer the following questions. What is the difference between the plan and the schedule? Why do I need to develop the plan and the schedule? Who is responsible for developing the plan and the schedule? When should you prepare the plan and the schedule and submit them to the OPR for its review? You would also have gained a greater understanding of, among other things, how to identify and analyze your organization's procurement portfolio, how to develop the various sections of the annual procurement plan, including establishing your organization's procurement objectives and strategies you can use to achieve those objectives. Since the plan is not just a schedule of activities, Devika and Ian will also cover how to establish your organization's procurement capacity baseline and what strategies you can employ to build your procurement capacity over time in order to consistently improve on procurement performance. And last but not least, how to go about developing, publishing, and updating your annual schedule of planned procurement activities. So now, let me encourage you to give your full attention to Ian and Devika as they take you through today's webinar on developing the annual procurement plan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. So without further delay, we now welcome policy officers, Ms. Singh and Mr. Samaru, who will take us through the presentation. Ms. Singh?
So good morning. Good morning, everyone, again, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Developing the Annual Procurement Plan. The main purpose of today's webinar is to assist you, our primary stakeholder, in preparing your annual procurement plan by providing you with a clearer understanding on exactly how this task should be performed. Our presentation today is divided into 3 main sections. Section 1 provides an overview of the annual procurement plan. Section 2 provides a step-by-step review of the annual procurement plan template, which, as some of you may know, can be found on the OPR in the OPR's general guideline developing the annual procurement plan. You can access this guideline on the OPR's website as well as in the handout tab of today's webinar. And lastly, section 3 of our presentation will look at the preparation of the annual schedule of planned procurement activities. Section 1, overview of the annual procurement plan, or the plan as it will be referred to throughout our presentation. So, the question that some of you may be asking yourselves at this time is why? Why should I learn to prepare an annual procurement plan? Well, the answer is pretty simple. The Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act mandates ministries and public bodies to prepare one. Under Section 13H of the Act states that one of the main functions of the OPR is to audit and review the system of procurement and disposal of public property to ensure compliance with the objectives of the Act. Section 13J states that the OPR shall review procurement practices and delivery systems on an annual basis to identify best practices. And Section 27(1) of the Act states a public body shall no later than 6 weeks after the approval of the national budget publish on its website or in any other electronic format information regarding all planned procurement activities for the following 12 months. Therefore, it is within these sections of the Act that all ministries and public bodies are required to prepare and submit their plan, and failure to do so can constitute a breach of the Public Procurement Act. Now we take a look at an overview of the plan. So what exactly is the annual procurement plan? This is an internal document prepared by you in which you develop your strategy so that you can manage your procurement-related risk and opportunities in relation to your procurement activities to support the delivery of your ministry or public body's mandate. The main purpose of the plan, however, is to ensure that procurement activities of ministries or public bodies are undertaken consistently to a high standard, efficiently and effectively in order to achieve the objects outlined in the Act. The plan is one of the control points in the internal control framework for procurement operations and is a key tool in strengthening accountabilities in ministries and public bodies. The guideline on internal control framework for procurement can also be found on the OPR's website for further clarification. The plan is to be developed by the named procurement officer in collaboration with the ministry or public body's internal stakeholders, that is, departmental heads and budget holders, utilizing its annual estimate of capital, recurrent, and PSIP expenditure. So what does the plan intend to achieve? 1, it provides a logic for allocating scarce resources to the overall procurement effort. It identifies the aspect of procurement effort that will be targeted for performance improvement and associated performance measures. It also focuses procurement efforts on supporting business goals and objectives. Section 2, preparing the annual procurement plan. At this point, I kindly direct all participants to the handout tab of the webinar, where you will find a short case study that we will be using throughout this presentation as a work example. Secondly, we will be going through each section of the annual procurement plan template as provided in the general guideline, which most of you might be familiar with by now. So we therefore recommend that you have these documents readily available during the presentation, as it will provide you with a clearer understanding of the steps involved in preparing your plan. So this document, the guideline, can also be found in the handout tab, as I said, as well as on the OPR's website. So let's take a look at the case study. As the named procurement officer at the Ministry of Technology, you are asked to prepare the annual procurement plan and annual schedule of planned procurement activities for fiscal year 2020 to 2021, given the following information. Item 1, the Ministry of Technology mandate and strategy, which includes 1, to develop and implement a reliable, secure information, communication, and technology system. 2, to develop and implement a performance and human resource management system for employees. And 3, to develop and maintain a sustainable stakeholder relationship program. Item 2 of this case study includes a portfolio listing for the fiscal years 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021. This portfolio listing identifies all items that were actually procured in fiscal year 2019 to 2020, as well as all items estimated to be procured in the coming fiscal 2020 to 2021. So, for example, for ministries and public bodies, these items will be located in your annual estimates for recurrent expenditure and development programs. For smaller entities like non-governmental organizations, these items may be included in your project proposals. Details of goods, works, and services required by the public body, that is, its description, quantity, and cost, can be found in documentation such as invoices, receipts, purchase orders, or in the ministry or public body's accounting software package. Item 3 shows the number of vendors, purchase orders, and transactions mapped against the quadrant of the procurement portfolio analysis. So based on the table, we see that for fiscal 1920, the total number of vendors who provided goods, works, and services to the Ministry of Technology was 80. Whereas for fiscal 2020 to 21, this total is estimated to increase to 20. Total purchase orders issued for fiscal 1920 amounted to 82, whereas the estimated amount for fiscal 2020 to 21 is estimated at 100. And transactions for fiscal 1920 amounted to 36, whereas for fiscal 2020 to 21, this amount was reduced to 15. the annual procurement planning process. In order to begin our preparation, of the annual procurement plan for the Ministry of Technology, let us first briefly take a look at the planning process involved in carrying out this task. Step one includes reviewing the organization or public body's mandate and strategy. This is simply because procurement activities support the ministry or public body's mandate or objectives on a daily basis by obtaining the necessary inputs for the ministry to do its work. Step 2 of the planning process is twofold and involves the organization's procurement portfolio and its function and capability. This step is critical to the planning process, and as such, a significant part of our presentation today will focus on explaining this step further. Step 3 involves identifying strategic procurement objectives. This stems from the analysis of step 2. However, examples of such objectives may include to manage the procurement process and the supply base efficiently and effectively, to minimize the organization transaction costs and services. Step 4 is the development and implementation of the procurement strategy, which is the completion of the annual procurement plan and the actual implementation of the plan within the ministry or public body. And lastly, step 5, measure results. This involves monitoring the entity's activities and transactions to assess its performance over time and to ascertain whether the procurement strategies is present and functioning. Examples of monitoring tools may include monthly reports by the named procurement officer and contract delivery progress and closeout reports. So, assuming that we have completed step 1 of the annual planning process, which is to review the ministry's mandate, as the named procurement officer or NPO at the Ministry of Technology, the starting point in preparing your annual procurement plan involves developing your portfolio listing, which is step 2 of the procurement planning process. We will now take a look at the portfolio listing for fiscal year 2019 to 2020. And in subsequent slides, my colleague, Mr. Samaru, will take you through the ensuing fiscal period. So based on the portfolio listing before us, we can see that the Ministry of Technology procured 8 items for this period, ranging from computer equipment, promotional or corporate events, contracted specialized IT services, training, technology, office stationery, office supplies, and toner, all at a total cost of $2,625,300. Now the question arises as to what do I do with this information? As a named procurement officer, you are required to analyze the procurement portfolio. This can be performed by utilizing several strategic sourcing tools. such as the Pareto analysis, Porter's five competitive forces model, supplier preferencing model, the procurement portfolio analysis, and supplier positioning model. While this presentation will examine only some of these tools, further explanation on them can be accessed on the OPR's website via a video recording or even a slide presentation at your convenience. So we will first analyze the procurement portfolio by using the Pareto analysis. Now, the Pareto principle, which is also known as the 80-20 rule, is based on the premise that 20% of efforts can lead to 80% of results. That is, if 20% of all purchase transactions account for 80% or more of the total expenditure, then focusing on these purchases so that administrative effort is used efficiently can optimize the return on procurement effort. So let us revert to our example. As the named procurement officer at the Ministry of Technology, the first step in analyzing our portfolio listing using this Pareto tool requires you to sort this list by price, starting from highest value item to the lowest value item. Secondly, a running total of all expenditure items are calculated simply by adding the cost of each item as we move down the running total column. So for example, the running cost at row 3 equals to $2,157,800, which is the sum of computer equipment, corporate events, and contracted specialized services. It should also be noted that the last running total should match the overall total cost. And thirdly, in conducting the Pareto analysis, the percentage of expenditure represented by each item should be calculated. And this is done by simply placing a running total over the overall annual cost and calculating a percentage. Now, the outcome of the Pareto analysis in this example shows that the first 3 items, which are computer equipment, corporate events, and contracted specialized IT services, represent over 80% of expenditure. The value of the remaining 5 items total less than 20% of the overall expenditure. This would suggest that the Ministry of Technology should invest most of its administrative efforts in the procurement of the first 3 items in the list and should develop strategies to minimize its administrative efforts for the procurement of the remaining 5 items. These strategies, however, will be discussed later in our presentation. Another tool that will assist a procuring entity, which is you, the ministry or public body, in conducting a more in-depth analysis of its procurement portfolio is the Procurement Portfolio Analysis tool, which is also known as the Chiralgic Matrix. This tool allows the procuring entity to analyze the items or category of items in its procurement portfolio by taking into consideration the relative value of the item and the difficulty of securing supply for this item, and placing it into one of the 4 quadrants. So quadrant 1, routine products, are usually low value, low volume items. They represent routine procurement processing and typically represent up to 90% of the organization's suppliers and a very high proportion of transactions. There's generally competitive local supply markets for these type of items. So based on our case study, an example of routine items may include office stationery. Quadrant 2, leverage products. These are goods and services commonly used across the entire organization in high volumes. They often include goods where there is potential for reduction of inventory management, handling, and storage costs. These markets may be served by a few suppliers with extensive distribution networks. Based on our case study, an example of a leverage item may include computer equipment. Quadrant 3, bottleneck products. These are highly specialized goods, services, or works. The procurement of these items often involves technical experts, and there are often only a few potential suppliers. Usually, there are only a few transactions within this category. Therefore, based on our case study, an example of a bottleneck item would include toner for a very specific type of printer. And lastly, strategic products, which represent goods, services, or works that are critical to the organization. They are often complex, bundle or package of goods and services. They require innovative solutions and high-level expertise from suppliers. This category represents very few transactions, and there are often very few suppliers available. The cost in forming contracts for strategic products are substantial for both the procuring organization and the supplier. So based on our case study, an example of a strategic product would include contracted specialized IT services for a database. Additionally, the analysis conducted using the Pareto analysis tool can assist a public body in determining whether an item belongs in low or high value category, whereas the analysis conducted using Porter 5 forces can assist ministries or public bodies in determining whether an item belongs in low or high risk categories. So our next slide provides a breakdown of the Ministry of Technology procurement portfolio analysis. for fiscal 1920 in a tabular format. Now, this table shows whether each item is considered a high-risk or low-risk item based on our portfolio analysis, as well as whether items are classified as high-value or low-value expenditure items based on our Pareto analysis. The data shown in this table can also be represented in a diagram format in our next slide. Now, from this diagram, it is much easier to see the categorization of each of the items outlined in our portfolio listing within the 4 quadrants. It is therefore noteworthy to mention that most of the items listed in our case study fall within the routine category, with only 1 or 2 items placed in the leverage, bottleneck, and strategic categories. Additionally, participants should note that an item categorized within one quadrant by one public body may be categorized in a different quadrant by another, often due to varying procurement portfolio of each public body. This diagram also shows the percentage of total spend of each quadrant, which will be explained further in the next slide. But at this point, I do implore you to take note of these percentages and the number of categories in each of these quadrants. So, routine items amount to approximately 17.7% of total expenditure, with 4 number categories. Leverage items amount to 63% of total expenditure, with 2 number categories. Bottleneck items amount to 0.03% of total expenditure, with only 1 number category. And lastly, strategic items amount to approximately 19% of total expenditure, with only 1 number category. So how did we calculate total spend for each category? Let's take an example. Well, based on the data derived from our case study, routine items amount to 17.78% of total expenditure. This is calculated by adding the sum of all routine items. In this case, that includes training, telephone, office stationery, and office supplies, and dividing it by the overall expenditure to obtain a percentage. This formula is done for each quadrant of the procurement portfolio matrix. In addition to analyzing the data obtained from the portfolio listing by expenditure, as explained in our previous slides, this data can also be analyzed by other means as shown in the distribution of quadrant table, that is, by vendors, purchase order, transactions, and categories. So let us firstly analyze vendors. Referring to our case study, you would have noticed that the total number of vendors used, that is, they were paid for goods and services and works rendered to the Ministry of Technology for fiscal 1920 amounted to 18. And out of those 18 vendors, 10 of them provided routine products. Therefore, approximately 55% of all vendors used by the Ministry of Technology provided only routine items. Next, we look at purchase orders. The total number of purchase orders issued for the fiscal 1920 by the Ministry of Technology amounted to 82. And of that 82, 70 purchase orders were issued for routine items. Therefore, approximately 85% of all purchase orders issued by the Ministry of Technology were allocated to routine items. Moving on to transactions. Now, this refers to the number of rounds of procurement conducted within the fiscal period. So instead of issuing, for example, a request for quotation every time the Ministry of Technology needs to purchase office stationery, which may be 4 to 5 times for the year, the ministry can issue or establish a framework agreement over a 2-year period, thereby resulting in only one transaction occurring for these type of items, then reducing, which will ultimately reduce the administrative effort in procuring routine products. So reverting to our example, 36 transactions occurred within the fiscal 1920, of which 30 were as a result of routine items. Therefore, approximately 83% of all the transactions conducted by the Ministry of Technology were due to routine items. Lastly, we analyze categories. Out of a total of 8 categories as outlined in our portfolio listing for the Ministry of Technology, 4 of these categories fall within the routine quadrant. Therefore, routine items amount to 50% of all category of items used by the ministry. So now at this point, I will hand you over to my colleague, Mr. Samaru, to continue with our presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Singh. So moving forward, we'll be discussing the portfolio listing for the next fiscal year 2020 to 2021. And in a few slides coming up, you will see an analysis for this portfolio, which is similar to what Ms. Singh, my colleague, has done previously for 2019. On this slide, we will see the category listing, promotional items, computer, contracted services, and all what have you for training, telephone, and up to toners, the description, and the estimated cost for this fiscal, amounting to just over $3 million. Next, we will undertake the Pareto analysis, similar exercise that my colleague just did for 2019. If you look at the columns to your right, you will see that the estimated cost listed from highest to low. So the items were categorized and classified in that order from highest spend to the lowest spend. The running total, similarly to what Ms. Singh has calculated, and then the percentages of total expenditure. You'll see at the bottom for the running total adds up to the total estimated cost for the fiscal 2020 to 2021. Now moving on further to the analysis, the procurement portfolio analysis, we keep adding columns to your right. As we undertake more analysis, you would see in terms of the risk spend analysis, we have identified the different items in terms of low risk, high value, and we have took the privilege of identifying the relevant quadrant it falls in. So take, for example, the promotional corporate events considered as a low risk, high value, and obviously it falls in the leverage quadrant. For the contracted specialized IT service, for this fiscal, the analysis reveals that is a high value and high risk, and it resides in the strategic quadrant. Replicating that data into the procurement portfolio matrix, you can see where we have identified the 4 quadrants, listed the categories for each of these procurement spend. You'll see for routine, low risk, low value. You have training, telephone, stationery, and office supplies. We have also shown the percentage of spend for each of these quadrants. So for routine, we have just over 20%. For leverage, over 58%. The bottleneck item, just under 1%. And the strategic, just marginally over 21%. In distribution of the quadrants, by the quadrants, this table provides a distribution of the relevant quadrant and the percentage in terms of expenditure, vendors, purchase order, transaction, and categories. Now, this figure is in line with the figure 2 on section 332 of the general guidelines for developing the annual procurement plan. We emphasize that including data from previous year's procurement increases the accuracy of your plan and generate a more realistic projection. Now, this slide is of critical importance to the annual procurement plan. Having compared both fiscal years' portfolio matrices, one can see at a glance of the change in percentage of expenditure for each of the 4 quadrants between 2019 and 2020. More noticeably, we can see that leverage items were recorded in excess of 50% of the total expenditure for both years, 2019 and 2020, which is indicative that the public body or ministries is benefiting from leverage procurement. An example in our case would be the ICT equipment. Given there is a large pool of suppliers in the market capable of providing ICT equipment, you may choose to buy in bulk rather than individual items, thereby increasing competition among the suppliers and securing a better deal. In other words, you want to achieve economies of scale. One certain way to increase the competition for the goods as a public body or ministry would be by simply publishing the annual schedule of planned procurement activities on your website. This form of advertising would expose your procurement activities to even more suppliers, as well allowing new entrants into the market. Now, if you look at section 331 and figure 1, procurement portfolio matrix, within the general guidelines, shows the percentages of expenditure within each quadrant, which can be used as a guide. It refers to routine procurement, which has a less than 5% of expenditure, leverage ranging from 20 to 30%, bottleneck ranging from 1% to 5%, and strategic taking the bulk of the spend, 50 to 60%. Now we look at the comparison of the fiscal period. This is where it gets interesting. Let's draw some comparison between the fiscal years. As a public body or ministry, you may choose to include additional headings as what you have listed in the table as part of your analysis. Basically, the more information available allows you the opportunity to justify your plan and identify areas for future improvements. Example in the case, whether you have a contract spanning several fiscal years. The key is identifying where to record the transaction within which fiscal year. This table also allows you to make quick determination as to whether progress, if any, were made during the last fiscal. Say in terms of whether the percentage of transaction costs was reduced. This information would be necessary to complete section 2.2 progress of the general guidelines. Now, how do we use the plan to complete the data? As we go through the analysis, we would address certain areas in terms of strategies, progress, procedures, and system, which would then feed into the plan. In subsequent slides, we would attempt to address each quadrant along with examples. Now, while you're on the same table, let's look at a routine in procurement, a low value, low risk. In comparing the overall percentage expenditure between 2019, 2020, and 2020 to 2021, no significant increase in the percentage of expenditure for the new fiscal was recorded. The figure just jumped from 17.78% to just over 20%, in fact 20.27%. Now, while we're under the routine procurement, let's look at transaction and purchase order columns. And you might ask yourself this question: how can I improve in reducing my transaction cost? For fiscal year 2019-2020, the percentage of transaction was 83.33%, while purchase order was 85.37%. This basically shows that for routine procurement, namely office stationeries and training, a lot of time and effort was spent in 2019 on transactions being undertaken by procurement officers or administrative staff in processing purchase order and invoices. This can obviously be one area of improvement where you can focus efforts to reduce transaction costs while they increase efficiency. Moving forward for the fiscal 2020 to 2021, the percentage of transaction was projected to be over 80%, while purchase order was targeted at 90%. This simply indicates that the public body or ministry has identified areas of improvement from the last fiscal in reducing transaction costs by simply introducing some form of framework agreement for routine procurements. So let's look at a section 332 of the general guidelines for developing the annual procurement plan. We look at routine procurement, low value, low risk. So in terms of the objective, what would be your objective? We spoke about these in a few slides previously. The objective for routine procurement would be to reduce transactional administrative costs altogether. In terms of your strategy, a strategy to achieve this can be setting up a framework agreement or service level agreement. That is, engaging a few suppliers over a specific period of time for the supply of office equipment, etc., in an attempt to reduce transaction time and effort. This reduces the administrative work required in terms of number of purchase orders which has to be generated. As an organization, a ministry or public body, you would consider decentralization. Have administrative staff undertake these activities, basically follow through with purchase order and invoices, or process these invoices. You might also want to consider encouraging local suppliers to view your ministry or your public body as a valuable client, resulting in basically lowering your transaction cost. In terms of system, to make the transaction process more efficient, you can look at implementing a software or simple and a spreadsheet, or even going as far as using a specialized payment system, or ACH, to optimize payment and process purchase orders faster than a conventional method. In this way, you can reduce the cost of transaction and eliminate invoicing error. In terms of policies and procedures, consider transferring decision-making powers to lower-level administrative staff so that they can make decisions at the point of need. Take, for example, in the procurement of stationeries. As a public body or ministry, how often would you use stationeries? Every 3 months. So have a system in place to allow administrative staff to make these decisions when the goods are required or needed. In terms of your skills, you can identify what training would be necessary for both procurement staff and administrative staff based on your routine procurement. Training into the use of the ACH software so that it would allow the system to become more transactional. Now, as part of the skill development, you can take note that You can also visit the OPR website where training material or webinars are available. Now, lastly, once you have analyzed the various strategies for improving the procurement objectives, we must now measure the performance of the procurement system to record any improvement. We can use key performance indicators. In our case, we would like to use the procurement cycle KPI. This is used to determine the average time span between, let's say, a receipt of a purchase requisition, basically to procure office furniture or office stationaries, to the time when the purchase order is issued to the supplier. This information enables conclusion to be drawn on the efficiency of the system. Another KPI, which is applicable to this scenario, is the quality KPI. It's basically the ratio of rejection, which is the value of goods rejected over the value of the goods received. Now, we revert back to the previous slides. And let's continue with the comparison of the previous table. Similarly to what was done for routine segment, public bodies or ministries can treat the remaining segments accordingly. Let's focus on another scenario, a leverage item, high value, low risk. And we'll look at our example in our case study, the promotional events, which are basically venues, audios, banners, what have you. As a public body or ministry, one of the objectives is to have total cost reduction in leverage procurement. You may choose to buy in bulk to get a better value, thereby achieving economies of scale in the case of the ICT equipment. In so doing, transactional costs are reduced altogether since you have fewer transactions in terms of purchase order. In the case of promotional corporate events, the strategy to achieve the objectives would be to engage advertising agencies to undertake the ministry's promotional events during off-peak hours. This would allow price reduction, thereby reducing the value of the procurement. You can also explore the option of collaborating with other public bodies when they are undertaking their promotional events. Let's look at a bottleneck item. And a typical example which we have identified for this case study is a toner. For both fiscal years 2019-2020 and 2020-2021, the percentage of expenditure amounts to less than 1%. As mentioned earlier, one of the ministry's goal and objective would be risk reduction. Now, even though the value of the item is low, any unforeseen challenges with the supply of this good would have considerable repercussion. In the case of a toner, a simple strategy for reducing risk would be the possibility of holding extra stock of toners throughout the useful life of the photocopier or the printer. Other strategies can be to identify alternative source of goods to meet the requirement. That is, see whether there are readily available alternative toners on the market. By extension, in cases where you are looking at an organization or public body to procure new items or a new printer or copier, see what products are being close to being discontinued and focus efforts on new products. Also, consideration can be made in terms of implementing a framework agreement to secure suppliers for key goods. Now, a strategic item, a high value, high risk of supply. And we look at the contracted specialized IT service. For the fiscal 2019-2020, the percentage of expenditure amounts to just over 19%. While for 2020 to 2021, the percentage of expenditure is projected to 21.46%. That is, the ministry has increased its budgetary allocation for this strategic project. In that case, it will be beneficial to focus greater effort in undertaking a strategic project and see what strategy can be used to achieve value for money over time. Now, during the last fiscal, the ministry indicated that it had limited experience in handling strategic projects of this nature. The ICT equipment could be primarily due to non-availability of technical staff in terms of preparing specification and terms of reference. As a result of not fully understanding the specifics of the contracted IT service, they opted to tender the entire ICT service under one contract. This, however, led to several challenges, cost variation being one of them, during the contract management stage, specifically with regards to managing the relationship with the supplier. Now, in moving forward for this fiscal, the ministry has identified that in order to achieve its procurement objective, one can simply seek assistance from other public bodies to provide the required skill and capabilities. You can draw a quick example. You can probably liaise with other government agencies like iGovTT to assist in preparing detailed specification in terms of reference for these IT services. This can potentially lead to a recommendation to have the complexity of the requirements reduced, which results in the services being unbundled into less complex procurement. Now, by extension, the ministry will try to maintain constant communication with suppliers, the benefit of which can lead to timely identification of risk and relevant mitigation strategies, such as in the case where foreign contracted IT services are not physically available. We can say basically due to a lack of flight in the country. As a result, measures were put in place to reduce the risk by allowing these services to work virtually. So what we have done there, basically in a nutshell, is we performed a risk assessment. Now, at this point, we'd like to take the opportunity to hand over to Mark. Rhonda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samaru. Stakeholders, at this time, we will be taking a short 10-minute intermission where you can refresh yourselves and take a little break from your screens. We are seeing your questions coming in, and we do have a segment for questions and answers. So we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A section of our portal. We will address them later on in our session. So we will resume at approximately 10:12 a.m. We will have a countdown timer on our screens.
Thank you again, Rhonda. We apologize for those technical challenges, so let's move on to the presentation. We'll take you now to the introduction, which forms part of the body of the plan itself. Now, previously, we have done several analysis on the portfolio analysis for 2019 and 2020. The information gathered and the information compiled would be fed into the body of the plan itself. So at this point, we want to introduce this section. This section should be written once you have completed the analysis and have an appreciation of the planned improvement, as it's basically an executive summary of the entire plan. So the introduction speaks to, one, an explanation of your programmatic goals and objective and how procurement effort supports these achievements. Now we'll draw some examples that what we have done during the analysis, and you'll see how these examples and case studies apply to the preparation of the plan. In this case, for the strategic ICT procurement, the procuring entity must have an appreciation of the high risk of supply and high value of this item. As such, greater attention should be made in undertaking thorough market research in identifying your market. Discuss with key stakeholders to assist in developing your procurement strategies in preparation of solicitation document. As part of the introduction, it sets out the main focus of the plan for the current year, comparing and contrasting it to previous year plan. Now, we have done this previously when we compared both procurement portfolio for 2019 and 2020. We have looked at the track record for previous year's achievements. Now, you want to focus on certain achievements in the forthcoming year in an effort to increase efficiency. In our case, the main focus in the upcoming year is to reduce transaction costs altogether. The introduction also speaks to an explanation of the procurement-related risk and opportunities in the forthcoming period. Basically, we are dealing with risk management. We have captured procurement-related risk when we touched previously on bottleneck and strategic procurements. In principle, information on prior year's procurement-related risk formed the basis for identifying possible risk in the forthcoming year procurement. In prior year's procurement, minimal communication was held with suppliers, as an example. In moving forward, you would try to improve and maintain a constant relationship with your suppliers throughout the entire procurement process. This allows you the ability to identify possible risks and take the necessary mitigation approach in treating with these risks. In the case of the toners and the issue of it being discontinued, as an example. Now, if you require further guidance on risk management, I ask you to could visit the OPR website at your convenience. And there is a webinar that we did in 2019 that deals with specifically with risk management. And fourthly, the introductions highlights an explanation of how the plan addresses general practice improvement specific to the public body or ministry's goal and objective, as well as the objectives outlined in each segment. We've looked previously at the segment under routine procurement under section 332 of the general guidelines, where we dealt with specific objectives, organization, systems, policies, and procedures in support of the achievement of the public body's goals and objectives. Section 2.0 deals with current status of the entity procurement management. At this point of the presentation, you might ask yourself, as a named procurement officer, what's next? Given our analysis of the prior year's performance and procurement of any strategies implemented within this period, the section asks the question, how are you now handling procurement? It's quite simple. The analysis conducted can now be used to inform the body of the plan in terms of background. In terms of the background, what is your current capacity in terms of the forthcoming procurement? And how are you now going to handle these procurement? It deals with progress. During your analysis of the portfolio matrix, when we compare and contrast both fiscal years, we have discussed progress as it relates to whether specific objectives in terms of reducing transaction costs and increasing efficiencies were achieved. It also addresses issues arising from prior year's performance. This explains the result of baseline performance measurement and how these can be used to make decisions in forthcoming procurement strategies. Now let's look at each of these in a little more detail. In terms of the background, under section 2.1 of the general guidelines, in our case, we had two goals and objectives for the Ministry of Technology would be to minimize transaction costs of goods and services and improve supplier relationship management. In terms of the procurement-related challenges, let's take corporate events, promotional events as a leverage procurement. The goal is to benefit from leverage procurement while attempting to reduce the value of the item. To achieve this objective, you would prefer to target suppliers when they are again in the downtime period in the market, and the competition would therefore be high. The risk of engaging promotional events during peak hours can result in the lack of bids from suppliers, as they would focus their efforts on other clients who basically pay on time. The analysis of the procurement portfolio and the key issues in prior year's performance. We have done so previously when we compared both procurement portfolio for 2019 and 2020 and focus on trends made within prior year's portfolio. This would, however, inform decision makings in 2020. In terms of the procurement function and the associated capacity assessment, analysis on prior years' strategic procurements, the high-value, high-risk procurements, whether the public body or ministry achieved the outcome of these procurement at the expense of considerable amount of effort. In our case, the outcome of the ICT equipment, the output would be the efforts by the procuring unit to deliver the outcome. That is, the public body or ministry at the time did not have the key technical staff to undertake preparation for, let's say, the specification for the ICT equipment. This task was left to the procurement staff to exert considerable effort and output to prepare in order to achieve the outcome. This therefore reduces efficiency. Under item 2.2, progress. Now, we've touched on progress on previous slides on identifying what progress were made during the last fiscal and how these lessons learned inform decision-making process in the ensuing period. You want to ask yourself, during the last fiscal year, what progress were made? Treating with more routine procurement as leverage to achieve economies of scale and get better value for money. You also look at further improve on the supplier relationship to allow suppliers, both foreign and local, to have the ability to disclose information on possible future market changes. We also mention improvement in terms of seeking assistance from other public bodies in terms of preparation of solicitation documents and assisting with evaluation, which the ministry does not possess. And thirdly, under this section 2.0 deals with issues arising from prior year's performance. What are your baseline measurements for measuring prior year's performance and how these will assist in future procurement management strategies? Now we focus on performance management or measurement. In order to do this, we have to establish a baseline or starting point to draw a reference to how the procurement activities are performing. The use of setting up KPIs would be necessary to monitor. In our case, we draw on two applicable KPIs. The procurement cycle KPI is used to determine the average time span, let's say, between the publication of a procurement notice and the conclusion of the contract. This information draws conclusion on the efficiency of the system. Now, based on the results of these indicators, you can draw several conclusions for corrective actions. Let's say whether the procurement department has a required staffing to execute certain levels of procurement, or whether the competency level of staffing needs to improve. We touch on the quality KPI, which is basically the value of the goods rejected over the value of goods received as a ratio of rejection. Item 3.0, the purpose and nature of the annual procurement plan. How to improve and manage the procurement function during the ensuing period. We'll talk about general strategies for improving the procurement performance. In our case, the Ministry of Technology have identified the following procedures. Identify who are your stakeholders, both internal and external. And as mentioned previously, and we cannot reiterate this, you need to maintain and improve constant communication with your suppliers. You also need to communicate with your suppliers, indicating that as a public body, you do not always pay on time. And it would be beneficial for suppliers or potential suppliers to have some level of cash flow. Identify what are the issues. In this case, identify and assess whether you have the competent staff, procurement staff, to undertake strategic procurement. Then we look at the second item, strategies to address procurement management in support of the program business effectiveness. The strategy to address procurement management would be you need to have clear identification of your goals and objectives. You need to identify your desired results. What are these deliverables and what do you expect? You also need to set some time frames to achieve these objectives or deliverables. You need to explain your strategy of how it would be implemented. And then finally, to measure performance, you need to introduce KPIs. And thirdly, under section 3.0, strategy for managing the risk and opportunities in the procurement portfolio. One main risk we are familiar with is the non-participation of suppliers in doing business with public bodies, probably as a result of lack of timely payment. A possible way to mitigate this risk would be to establish and maintain constant communication with your suppliers and to communicate with them of upcoming procurement and that the ministry is still committed to pay and we still want to do business with you. Under section 3.1 of the annual procurement plan template identifies the stage of the public body or ministry's growth progress in order to develop a capacity. So what are your enablers, or what drives your procurement? Now, the first column lists your procurement enablers, which in this case refers to procurement leadership and governance, people, significant procurement planning, and managing supply. The second column speaks to baseline period observed practices, and this refers to where the public body is currently positioned in terms of its procurement capacity. This can either be basic capacity, an intermediate capacity, or you are at an advanced capacity. Now, these levels are clearly defined in the general guidelines, which we have published on our website for procurement capacity development. So, take for example, one of the procurement enabler people. The baseline period observed is that the procurement and the requisitor works as individual and not as a team. So that will give you an indication of your level of capacity. In terms of the planned improvement for most recent periods, column 3 requires public bodies to identify what improvement they intend to make in the current period regarding each procurement enabler in order to transition along the spectrum from basic to intermediate to advanced. So getting back at the enabler people, you would want more collaborative teamwork with procurement staff and requesters. And lastly, column 4, forthcoming year plan, refers to what initiatives the public body plans to undertake in order to improve its procurement capacity in the subsequent period. So again, we look at the people, procurement enabler people. And in terms of the forthcoming year plan, you want to have clear roles and responsibilities for team members. Now let's move on to section 3.2 of the annual procurement plan template. Enhancing program business effectiveness through better procurement management. How the adopted procurement strategy will support the achievement of programmatic business goals and objectives during the forthcoming period, with particular reference to the entity's priorities or major projects. Now, example in our case, the strategic project, the contracted IT specialist service project. One possible strategy would be to reduce risk and achieve value for money. This can be done by considering unbundling the procurement requirements to reduce complexity. Having secured assistance from other public bodies who have executed similar type procurements, seek guidance in terms of refining your requirements and specification to have the procurement disseminated into less complex procurement. Public bodies have to publish the annual schedule of planned procurement on your website to attract a wider pool of suppliers, thereby increasing the competitiveness of the procurement. This can achieve value for money and reduce the risk of supply since more vendors are available on the market. By extension, Maintaining constant communication with suppliers during the contract management stage has the availability of achieving your business goals. Now we have returned to the introduction. Now, having gathered all the relevant information from the previous section, this feeds into the content of the introduction, as it forms part of the executive summary of the annual procurement plan. In summary, we have analyzed the data, interpret the information to make informed decisions in forthcoming fiscal in order to prepare the annual procurement plan for the Ministry of Technology. Now, I trust that what was discussed provides clarity in terms of preparing your annual procurement plan. So, at this point, I now pass you over to Ms. Singh, where she will take you through the annual schedule of planned procurement activities.
Thank you, Mrs. Samaru. So now we move on to section 3, the annual schedule of planned procurement activities. The annual schedule of planned procurement activities is a document prepared by the ministry or public body outlining its planned procurement activities for the upcoming fiscal period. It provides potential suppliers and contractors with an idea of what procurement activities a public body has planned for the next 12 months. So as previously mentioned, public bodies are therefore required under Section 27(1) of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act to publish on its website or in any other electronic format information regarding all planned procurement activities for the following 12 months, no later than 6 weeks after the approval of the national budget. This table provides a template for the completion of the annual schedule of planned procurement activities and requires public bodies and ministries to publish basic information on its procurement activities, such as project number, project name, UNSPSC code, and the OPR recently completed a series of online sessions explaining the use of these codes, which are available on our website for your viewing at your convenience. The schedule should also include a brief description of the procurement. So in our case, we have the supply and delivery of 80 laptops and desktops. It should also include the proposed date for issue of bidding documents, expected delivery or completion date, estimated project duration, procurement method, standstill period, and contract type. It should be noted that the estimated values of the respective procurement activities should not be included in this document. I should also mention that once you publish your annual schedule of procurement activities on your website, this does not bind the ministry or public body to issue a solicitation for all the procurement activities, as this schedule may be updated from time to time during the fiscal year. However, a copy of the updated schedule shall be published on its website and submitted to the OPR within 3 working days of the approval of the revised schedule. The public body shall provide a printed copy of the annual schedule of procurement activities upon request from any potential contractor or any member of the public upon payment of a reasonable fee. And this fee shall be in alignment with the cost of reproducing and transmitting the printed schedule to the requester. So now, before we conclude our presentation, we'd like to go through a brief recap of some of the key learning points from today's session. Let's look at the annual procurement plan. This plan is an internal document prepared by the Ministry or Public Body to develop strategy to manage procurement-related risks and opportunities in relation to procurement activities. It is developed by the named procurement officer in collaboration with Ministry or Public Body's internal stakeholders, which are departmental heads. It is developed when preparing the Ministry of Public Body's annual estimate of capital recurrent and PSIP expenditure, and it should be submitted within 6 weeks of the approval of the national budget to the OPR for viewing. Now we turn our attention to the annual schedule of planned procurement activities. This document outlines the anticipated procurement activities of a ministry or public body for the upcoming fiscal period. It is to be submitted to the OPR as an insert or an appendix to the annual procurement plan. It does not include the value of procurement activities and can be updated during a fiscal period. And lastly, it is to be published on the ministry or public body's website no later than 6 weeks after the approval of the national budget. So in closing, we would like to thank you for your kind attention, and we do hope this presentation provided you, the public body, with clarification required to successfully complete your annual procurement plan.
Thank you very much, Ms. Singh, for your presentation, as well as Mr. Samaru for going through the annual procurement plan as well as the schedule. At this time, we invite you to go to the Q&A section of our portal, and we will be taking your questions. We are already seeing your questions to us. And just as a reminder, we do have our team, as part of our team, our chairman and procurement regulator, Mr. Munilal Lalchan. So should you have any questions for him directly, he is here to assist. All right, so we start one time with the questions. Our first question from Natalia Rabazad. How should public bodies deal with the procurement of marketing services, given the dynamic front needed, as well as being difficult to justify the quality and reputation of a firm?
Okay, that is a very important question, and it takes us back to the reason why we plan the procurements. I believe the question also mentioned the fact that you needed to justify why you will be going to a particular supplier or contractor. As you listen to the presentation this morning, you would recognize that emphasis was placed, for example, on the mandate and objectives of the public body. So in determining how you treat with items such as marketing spend, where you may want to pursue a particular level of quality, the first thing you have to recognize is this marketing spend a one-off, or is it actually an integral part of the public body's mandate? That will help you to decide whether the marketing spend falls within your strategic quadrant or whether it can be considered as leverage or routine. In terms of ensuring that you get the quality that you want and you want to go with the most reputable of firms, you will take that into consideration when you send out your solicitation document. And as you evaluate submissions, you will consider client references to assist you in that regard.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. We go to our next question from Ian, and he's asking, is costing to be provided on expenditure of individual items or on the item category?
Morning, Ian, and morning, all participants. Really nice to have all of you. Ian, I believe that you would have answered that question, that the expenditure or the costing associated with it would be on your plan, not on the activities, because to publish those information to the general public may compromise your ability to have some competitive advantage during the actual tender process. So we would have answered that, Ian. Hope that helps.
All right, and we're seeing another question from Theresa. And she's asking, how did we arrive at 8 categories?
Teresa, that's just for an example purpose in terms of demonstrating the tool. And you can have 100 different areas. However, you may want to bundle some of them when you are doing your activities because, for example, kitchen supplies, stationery, office supplies, and so on. You don't need to go down into the minute detail because then your the list becomes unwieldy. So you would have to use your initiative in terms of how you bundle the different activities.
Thank you, Mr. Lalchan. Our next question comes from David, and he's asking, the percent of total expenditure is calculated based on running totals or individual costs of each item?
It's running total by categories so that, for example, you would have seen stationery in one grouping. So once you decide your grouping, then you will do your cumulative totals based on your groupings that you have identified within the portfolio.
Our next question comes from Kamal, and he's asking, in the procurement portfolio analysis, what is considered a high or low relative expenditure?
And again, it depends on your unique business and each different business. For example, in some areas, and I'm going to use 2 examples here. For a ministry, something may be a high value item, but if you look at a public body like a state control enterprise, that might be a very low value item. So it depends on your business, will determine the whole issue of values and so on.
Thank you, sir. Our next question comes from Kamal again, and he's asking, how do you evaluate and accommodate cost centers that are unpredictable as they are generated by external requests or demands, for example, the legal service?
Again, at the beginning of the year, you are putting together a plan. So when you put together that plan, if you're a state-controlled enterprise, you develop a budget based on your business plan, based on your strategy or your strategic plan. So your strategic plan drives your business plan, which drives your budget. In the case of the ministry, you have to prepare those plans to submit to your various line ministry, to the Ministry of Finance. And therefore, you must have an idea of what the requirements are, whether it's legal services or consultancy services and so on, because that's what you put in your plan in the first case to get budgetary approval. So you must know what you are proposing to go. So legal services could be under one broad heading, but you must put it because you need the budget allocation. In addition to that, you have to also prepare that plan for your board of directors if you're a state-controlled enterprise, because that's how you get your budget approved. All we are asking you to do is to translate what's written in your budget in terms of your plan activities, in terms of your plan. So that all the information is already there, and you just need to put it in the format that we are requesting.
Thank you. Rachel is asking, how is the estimated vendors, purchase orders, and transaction percentages derived for fiscal 2020-2021?
And again, you would have seen based on the presentation, and that's another question we got is why do you need the 1920 figures? It gives you an idea from your historical information to project your future requirements. So history drives the future, and also the historical information that you are putting together helps you to create the efficiencies that you're looking for. And both Ian and Divika would have mentioned, when you look at the number of transactions based on your routine stuff, you may want to just go, instead of buying things every month, you develop a framework agreement. So that's where the advantage of using the data from 1 year translates into efficiencies in the future years. So I hope that helps in clarifying it. Remember, this is not about crunching numbers and crunching figures. It gives you an opportunity to improve year on year in how you do your procurement planning and execution.
Thank you for your response, Mr. Lalchan. Nirmala is asking, how do you measure transactions?
And let me ask Pastora to jump into that in terms of the transaction and so on.
Okay, so what you want to recognize is that as a public body, you will want to analyze your spend in a number of different ways because you want to be able to determine your performance, what it is like currently, and how do you want to work towards improvement. So what we can do in this instance is to take transactions as the number of rounds of procurement that the public body would have entered into during the fiscal. So let's say, for example, you went out to market 25 times for the year. Going forward, you may want to reduce the number of transactions to probably 20 by creating, as was mentioned before, framework agreements. That way you reduce your administrative burdens. So transactions, rounds of procurement.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Our next question comes from Janice, and she's asking, in calculating the portfolio analysis, do you include all categories of expenditure under the ministry's portfolio? For example, personal expenditures, goods and services, minor equipment, current transfers, and subsidies.
Okay, so in calculating your portfolio, what you are looking at is your procurement spend. So that could include your capital projects, it could include your developmental projects, as well as your recurrent expenditure. So once it's a procurement spend, you include it in your portfolio. What you will not include in your portfolio would be, for example, your HR costing, because that is not a procurement spend.
Thank you. And Janice and other stakeholders, you all could be sure to respond to us in the chat section just to let us know that we've accurately answered your question. So we have a question from Rexon. He's asking, tell me more about the use of ACH software.
Rexon, I'm not sure if the ACH software that you're referring to is the automatic clearinghouse facility in the banking sector. Yeah, so Ian would have mentioned that, and that's one of the tools that you can use, actually, different tools for electronic transaction processing and so on. So there are a number of tools out there. We can assist you if you contact us directly, Rexon, we can give you some more details.
All right, and we've seen a question from Gillian that I believe Ms. Brown would have answered previously, but it's just basically to describe define transactions and what exactly it represents. So we hope, Gillian, you would have gotten that response from Ms. Brown. Stanley is asking, to compare progress, could planned activities be compared to what actually happened in that same year? The comparison currently being done is between a previous year, actual expenditure, 2019 to 2020, and the estimate for the following year, 2020 to 2021.
So here's the plan, Stanley. Good question. First of all, you will be measuring 2021 to 1920 to see the improvements. Within the year, you will have your plan at the beginning of the year, and then at the end of the year, you will have to do a performance assessment against what you would have planned to do. Again, that would assist you when you're planning for 2021, 2022. So there are three different stakes you will be using and benchmark. One with the previous year, in the current year, and how you develop for the future year's planning. So yes, the answer is you can do an in-year performance plan versus budget, or actual versus plan, sorry.
Our next question comes from Dean, and he's asking, for a framework agreement for routine products, how do you cater for prices over a 2-year period or even a 1-year period? Based on what price, or is it that you allow variation within limits?
So then, very good question. When you're setting up a framework agreement, you can decide based on the type of framework agreement you want, if it's 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year. And then within that, you fix your pricing structure and you have conditions associated with it in terms of changes in the economy and so on. If, for example, you have a framework agreement that is determined with a lot of foreign exchange implications, you can have within there that if you do have a shock in your foreign exchange rate, that will translate into a negotiated rate going forward. So you can put the conditionalities associated with the framework agreement and determine whether it's a 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year, and determine what criteria will be used for cost escalation for those particular years.
Thank you, Mr. Lalchan. And Celia is asking if the session is available offline. And we actually have a recording of the session at the moment, and that link will be sent to you sometime during the course of the day. So you can look out for the link. Lorna is asking, she would like further clarification with regard to transactions. What exactly defines a transaction in the context of the table in section 3.32 in the APP?
All right, so I'm sure we would have answered that. Pastora would have just answered that a couple questions ago. If it's still not clear, we can also put some more information on the chat after the session.
All right, so you can look out for that information, Lorna. Kent Adams is asking us, or rather saying, unfortunately, there are continuing hindrances in timely invoice settlements, which do not foster better relationships with suppliers. What can be done in that instance?
So Ken, that's a good observation, and it's one that we always get when we have any type of sessions. So this is not unique to this session. Funding by the different ministries is always a challenge, and you have to know as the individual department how you do get your funding and how you can utilize those funding in the best way without going too much of your off-balance sheet financing as some persons would do. So it's something that you'll have to deal with your aligned ministries and the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you for your response, Mr. Lalchan. Esther is just asking if these slides will be available after the presentation. And Esther, we are looking at maybe tomorrow to start uploading the slides for the presentation. So we will send you all stakeholders an email just to advise. So you can stay tuned for that. Josephine is asking us, has the procurement bill been fully proclaimed as yet? If not, what is the new anticipated date of proclamation?
Well, Josephine, it's no longer a bill. The bill was converted into an act in 2015. I must say that if you have been listening to the public debates, but from both the government, the opposition, the public society, everybody seems to want to get the bill passed. Fully proclaimed. It was partially proclaimed, remember, in July of 2015 that allowed the office to be set up. The office has been set up and everything is in place from the office point of view in terms of setup. And we have had recent meetings with the Legislative Review Committee of Cabinet with a view to finalizing both the proposed amendments to the Act and the regulations. Those are almost completed, and we are hoping, as the Prime Minister promised us, it will be a high priority item after the budget. So we're waiting with bated breath, just like you. We want it done quickly.
Definitely. Mr. Lalchan, we have an excellent question from Amelia, and she's asking, when will procuring entities be required to start this activity? In December 2020, since the legislation has not yet been fully proclaimed?
Well, Amelia, you don't really need to wait, because some agencies, seriously, some agencies have started putting together their plans. They have been working with us. We have gotten completed plans from some of the public bodies. So it's a good practice to start now. You don't need to really wait until the act is fully proclaimed. And once you get a head start, you'll be ahead of the pack. And as I said, some agencies have already started that procurement planning activities.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Lancha. Marina is asking us, any update on the availability of Supreme?
We did discuss that whole issue of Supreme, and it's a 20-year-old software. And we have been trying, and we are still in discussion to get the full license assigned to the OPR so we could clean up the system and have it ready. So we have not given up, but it's taken a lot longer. And yes, doesn't seem to be any appetite for a 20-year-old software. So in the interim, we'll be looking at alternative to the Supreme. But if you are, like some of the ministries have been using it, we encourage you to continue to use it, but there are alternative tools like we would have shared this morning to identify a risk and look at your risks portfolio and so on.
We're seeing another question from Chris, and Chris is asking, subsequent to the publication of the annual schedule, if there are changes to be made, what would be the minimum timeline between publication for notification to the public and issuance of the tender? Is it that each organization has a discretion which must be stated in their special guidelines?
Just reading it over, what would be the minimum timeline between publication and notification? The answer would be that as soon as you have the relevant changes and you are in a position to get your internal approval, and as soon as you have your internal approval, it should be published. Because that's the best way to notify the public of the changes. And it shouldn't be for any small changes, really. It's substantial changes to your plan.
Certainly. Okay, and we'll just be sure to take one further question because we just want to respect your time. And that question comes from Derek, and he's asking, where your company's fiscal year does not coincide with that of the government, what is the date by which you will need to publish your plan?
The date still remains the same. What you would have to do is to take a section of a previous year. For example, if your financial year ends in December 31st and not September, if it coincides with the government fiscal of September, you're okay. But if it's a different fiscal, like it ends and some persons have it at the end of December, you will take a portion at 3 months of the previous year, 9 months of the current year, and develop your plan. So that's the best way to deal with it. You might even have a head start on other persons. And most likely, these will be relative to certain state-controlled enterprises, not ministries or departments and so on, because they will all coincide with the government 30th of September.
Thank you very much for your response, Mr. Lalchan. And that concludes our Q&A section this morning. We will publish some of the questions and answers and send it off to all our stakeholders in a subsequent email so that everyone will have an opportunity to see the responses based on the questions that were shared this morning. So at this time, I would like to welcome Ms. Tamara Roy, Head of Corporate Communications, who will deliver the closing remarks to our session this morning. Ms. Roy?
Thank you very much, Rhonda. Good morning, participants. As we close this webinar session on developing the annual procurement plan and the accompanying annual schedule of planned procurement activities, we do hope you found the content and format of this session not only insightful and informative, but also practical enough so that you can go back to your respective organizations and fully execute what is required. The OPR is heartened at the wide cross-section of attendees today, as this tells us that everyone understands that public procurement is not a one-man show. Rather, that it requires the combined efforts of a multidisciplinary team to ensure that the objects of the Act, as well as the strategic mandate and objectives of each public body, are achieved. We at the OPR are here to assist public bodies as we work together to transition to the new public procurement, retention, and disposal of public property regime upon full proclamation of the Act. Please feel free to reach out to the office at any time if you require assistance or further clarification on any related matter. You can use the feedback option on the OPR website, or you can send an email directly to stacia.mahabir@opr.org.tt, or you can utilize the email address that was provided for this webinar, app_apps@opr.org.tt. These email addresses will be sent in the chat section of the webinar platform. So in closing, I want to especially thank all of the permanent secretaries, commissioners, chief executive officers, and other accounting officers, named procurement officers, finance managers and officers, stores clerks, administrative officers, legal and other professionals, and public officers who participated and engaged with us today. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roy. And just on behalf of the team here at the OPR, we thank you again for your time and engaging feedback. And just as a reminder, when the webinar has ended, we welcome your feedback into our session this morning, and we ask that you complete a short survey. So thank you once again for being with us this morning, and we wish you a great day ahead.